Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and this is a response to the Off the Rope show, and them asking, who do you believe was the better wrestler? Was it Curt Hennig, Mr. Perfect, or was it Eddie Guerrero, Latino Heat? Now, this was a very difficult thing. I could see them both. I know that there was a certain level where you can actually see that the Slug Daddy did seem to win the discussion. And it's pretty clear that it's very interesting to say that Eddie Guerrero was more of a better all-around performer. Not taking into account the injuries both of them received, because Eddie Guerrero did have injuries along with his substance abuse. And I don't know if Curt Hennig had that type of problem as well. I believe he might have also had some level of substance abuse because of steroids, as well as Eddie having problems with steroids. I'm not going to get into that. I'll get into just the basic stuff. If you see it by a perspective, unlike with the video I made of Ric Flair and when you have Hulk Hogan, which one was better, and it all boiled down to promotion, how they were promoted. In this respect, both men were similarly promoted as mid-carders. In the very beginning when they first started, Curt Hennig in the AWA, and you have basically Eddie Guerrero, who started in Mexico, went to New Japan, he went to ECW and WCW. Curt Hennig went from AWA to WWF. So the different promotions that Eddie Guerrero went to was very varied. So you could say that Eddie has the edge in that, obviously. When it comes to their heritage, they're both basically even. They're both from second generation lineage. You have the Axe Hennig, and then you have Gory Guerrero, Eddie's dad and Curt Hennig's dad. The difference, I think, in how they were was that even though Eddie did start out in Mexico, then he went to New Japan, he didn't really work a lot with his father. He did work with his brothers and his cousin and his nephew, which is Chavo. And then you have Curt Hennig, where most of the time he did work by himself at first. Then he worked a couple of times with his dad, the Axe. And you could say that Curt Hennig had more contact with his father while wrestling than Eddie did with his father. He didn't have as big of influence. He was mainly working more by himself and with his brothers and his nephew. So I could say in that respect, the one with lineage who spent more time working with someone like his dad, you could say Curt Hennig had that. Now, both of them, when it came to the very beginning, when they first started, from what I could tell, because I have both their videos, both of them really didn't have a very large personality at first. Not until they reached the 90s. For Curt Hennig, he came in, I think, in the early to mid-90s. I think the mid-90s. 94, 93, around the time of Ric Flair. He was already known to have the establishment of Mr. Perfect. For Eddie Guerrero, by the time he went into WCW, I think by 95, for me, by 95 or 94, even maybe 96 is when he was really developing the Latino Heat, his character there. I think that's when he really started developing it really well then, because he was more acting like he was when he was from New Japan. Not saying he was wearing the mask of Black Tiger, but most of the mentality he had then was still in that set. Not until he reached WCW, which I think was way earlier than Curt Hennig, when he went to WWF at the time, where he already had built an established character. So Curt Hennig has that. He does. Now, going from WCW and WWF with Curt Hennig, it was WWF, and then he went to WCW. And most of the time when he was in WCW, he didn't really wrestle a lot due to the fact of his back injury. He was pretty screwed up. So he did a lot of commentary work. With Eddie Guerrero, he didn't really do a lot of commentary work at that time. Very rarely. he only did a lot of in-ring work. And like I said, the Latino Heat gimmick didn't start really building up until, at least my understanding, by at least 1994 to 1995. So having variation at that time, before the 2000s, Curt Hennig still had the edge over Eddie, because he was even though he didn't do a lot of in-ring work because of the injuries to his back, he still could do something more than just wrestle. Because from what I understand, a lot of wrestlers don't always transition very well into commentary. They have to really be very good at it, and Curt Hennig was. So by the time of the 2000s, where Curt Hennig had basically stopped wrestling for a while because of how badly his back was, Eddie had transitioned from WCW WWF to WWF/WWE, and he went from there to expand, doing similar to what Curt Hennig did. He expanded outwardly. He had the Lion, Cheat, and Steal gimmick with Chavo. They became tag team champions. Eddie went and became I think he went and had the United States champion maybe once, or the IC title. I'm not exactly sure. I know he got the WWE championship, which he deserved it, and he basically went from there. He also had the tag titles with Chavo. Didn't forget that. I can tell you this, though, that if you're going to compare the two, and forgetting about what happened in 2003 with Curt Hennig when he died, unfortunately, if you're going to see how the variations are in their character, I can say that by 2000, Eddie, even if Curt Hennig had still been working, Eddie had become more varied. He was able to do more interesting promos, more interesting vignettes, more interesting in-ring work, with like when they were doing the Lion, Cheat, and Steal gimmick, especially when he wasn't working with Chavo, when he worked with Chris Benoit, worked with Rey Mysterio, worked with Batista, worked with Kurt Angle. All those people he's worked with, he was able to do something interesting in the ring. If it was some type of in-ring segment where they set up pictures, or he's showing that he's going to steal from somebody, that is what he did. So if you see them both, who's better? If you take out if you take out completely both of them getting injured, like Eddie having a car crash and Curt Hennig hurting his back, and both of them basically were hurt. Both took steroids to a point. Both stopped, from what I understand, and both died. I would have to agree with Slug Daddy on only one respect, that because of the increased amount of time he had over Kurt, because by 2003 Curt Hennig had died, and from what I understand, by around the 2000s to 2003 he wasn't really wrestling, if I understand. I could be wrong about this. You can comment for me, ladies and gentlemen, if I'm right or wrong. But Curt Hennig had stopped wrestling for a while, spent a lot of time with his son, who is currently in WWE right now as McGillicuddy, which he should be using his name. It would be better for him, because even if he failed, then he can change his name to something else, but it would have been better for his son to actually use his name. But taking away from that, Eddie's got more time. He has a much more larger body of work. Now, if they both had been able to continue around the same time, who do you think would be better? If I had to take a guess, it would have been Eddie. Because even though Curt Hennig might have done more commentary work, maybe he might have done more vignettes, maybe more in-ring promos, he might have had his own type of show, you never know. The Perfect Show, you never know, he might have done that, like Piper's Pit and stuff. You never know with that, but I think he would have done more out-of-ring work than Eddie did in-ring work, because he was much better out of the ring than he was in the ring. So if you're going to see who is the best all around, it probably would be Eddie. Because even though if you take out the commentary, that he really didn't do much commentary at all. Sometimes he did a little bit of commentary if there was going to be some type of feud, but Curt Hennig was way better in commentary. You can't just go by commentary. You got to have more than that. And Curt Hennig did more commentary work at the end of his career and his life, unfortunately, than he did wrestling. And people remember not just your commentary, they also remember how much wrestling you did. and what variation you did, and Eddie was that. Now, I'm going to leave it at that. Eddie was a better all-around performer than Curt Hennig, but not by a lot. Believe me, the only reason Eddie's better is because he had more time. That's what I believe. Both of them are Hall of Famers. Both of them deserve your respect, ladies and gentlemen, because they worked very hard, and they sacrificed enough to end up basically losing their lives because of having some type of problem. I think both of them had heart attacks. But I wish to give one extra thing. Out of these two, wish add a third person that I believe that would rival both of them and possibly almost unseat Eddie Guerrero. Who do you think, and I will explain, who do you think amongst these three that is possibly the best all-around performer? Eddie Guerrero, you got Curt Hennig, Mr. Perfect, and Y2J, Chris Jericho. Now, why would I include a man who shouldn't be thought of? This is why. He has been around long enough that he overlaps them both. Now, Eddie knew Chris Jericho from New Japan back in the 80s. Curt Hennig, even though he was in AWA, didn't really directly work with him. I think they might have had some type of interaction, not in wrestling, in WCW, but really, I don't think they really wrestled each other. I don't think they ever had that actual chance. But if you're going to see who is the best all-around performer, I believe between these three, Chris Jericho possibly is one of the best out of them all. He started just like Eddie Guerrero. He went basically to Mexico and worked there. He went to New Japan just like Eddie did, and he met him there. He went to ECW with Eddie, with Dean Malenko, with Chris Benoit, and anyone else that came out there. They all worked together. WCW, you got Chris Jericho, who worked with Dean Malenko, Rey Mysterio, I'm probably sure Superman, Lucha Thunder Liger. He worked with Eddie himself. He worked with Chris Benoit. I'm sure he did. He essentially worked with every person that you could think of that Eddie Guerrero worked with. And essentially, during the time when Curt Hennig was in WCW, he was still dealing with these same people. And I'm sure Curt Hennig talked very well about him because he knew he had skills. By 1999, take that back. By the time he comes in 1999, September, I believe, and had that epic little showdown with The Rock on the mic, this is where Chris Jericho expanded well beyond Eddie Guerrero, not taking nothing from Eddie. I liked Eddie. A little something that not many people know for myself. You see, when I used to work, before I got injured, when I used to work in a nursing home laundry, I actually worked in two. But in the second laundry I worked at, one of my bosses actually knew Eddie Guerrero. And, well, not directly knew him, he knew his friend. He never said who it was. And he went and got a huge amount of shirts from his friend, from the friend that knew Eddie. I mean, all the old 2000 shirts, and 2004 shirts, the red one, the light and cheat and steel, he got a huge set for everybody in our department. And he said, and I asked him, what is Eddie like? Did you get a chance to meet him? He said, not completely. I spoke to the friend that really knew him, and he said he was such a great guy. He basically would give you shirt off his back for you. That's how great of a guy Eddie was. At least that's what I've been told. Now, what do I mean by what I just spoke about in the 2000s? You see, by the time that happened for me, that was around 2004, just before Eddie died. You already had Chris Jericho, who by 2000, 2001, 2002 had accomplished things that no one ever thought would be possible. When basically the alliance angle came in, when WCW was absorbed, what happened with that? Eventually you had the first undisputed champion. You could say he always talks about that, but honestly, they thought enough about Chris Jericho to give him the first title of that. Of course, The Undertaker had it. Eventually, you had Kurt, I can't believe I'm blanking on, Kurt Angle, Edge. A few people had that title. No, not Edge, sorry, my mistake. Edge never had I don't believe had the Undisputed title. I could be wrong, but I know that Kurt Angle and The Undertaker, they did get that title. They did. So, with Chris Jericho, he had the first run of it. The thing that a lot of people have said, what is the most memorable is your very first run, and he had it. He's a 9-time, I believe, IC champion. He's a multiple-time WWE champion, multiple-time World champion. He basically has gone through every title. I don't know if he was a U.S. champion. He might have been. I'm not sure. I don't think so. But essentially he was. He was a multiple tag team champion. He's worked with Christian. He worked with The Big Show. I believe he worked with, who else did he work with? I'm not sure. There was at least another couple of people he worked with. I'm sure he did. But essentially speaking is this. During that time he won all those titles. He kept changing his persona, his character, so much that right now, he had varied his character so much, I think he ran out of stuff to do. Right now, he's still working with, I'm the greatest in the world at what I do. Now, we know at this time that he's not in the WWE. I think he's going to go on the road with Fonzie again. And I'm not putting Fonzie in this. This is not about what you do outside of WWE. We're talking about here. We're talking about WWE. And I'm saying that out of these three performers, the one who has all around at this moment, even before you talk about Eddie dying, even before you talk about Kurt Hennig dying, that would be Chris Jericho. So I say that the best all-around performer at this moment in time, and if you take away all the way to 2005, would be Chris Jericho. So I hope you liked the Zane view and my video response to the Off the Rope show, who is better, Mr. Perfect or Latino Heat. Subscribe and comment. I hope I didn't piss anybody off with that one, because that's a very hard one to say who's better. But between those two, I say Eddie was better, only because he had more time. And between these three, I say Chris Jericho, because even if you cut his time to 2005, he was doing a lot of stuff just as much as Eddie. And he was varied just as much as Kurt Hennig. He really was. He even did commentary work, I believe. Not much, but he did do some. So I hope you enjoy it. Have a good night.